You may not have heard of John Minton, but he was for a time one of the most popular artists in Britain, more famous than his contemporaries Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud, and someone I've remained obsessed with for much of my life. It was this picture which first brought me to Minton during a trip to the National Portrait Gallery when I was a teenager. I was immediately arrested by it from across the room, the brilliant sketchiness of the shirt collar, the elongated face, but particularly by the eyes and the expression of melancholy. He mesmerised me, just as he had so many others before.
He was quite a daunting figure because he was very tall, very striking, and he had an intensity about him.
He was someone I admired very much. He clearly was a big influence on me and a friend.
He was the young spark of British painting.
Oh Johnny, how you can love.
John Minton was a prolific and hugely talented painter, one of the leading figures of post-war British art, and the most influential illustrator of his day.
It's really one of the most significant illustrated books of the 20th century.
You put it that high?
I would, yes.
And if he wasn't at the easel, he was here, at the very heart of the long drunken party which was bohemian Soho.
It was almost a switch in his back, switch it on, and things went wild.
But his wild exuberance masked a tortured soul, and in the shiver of a muscle, his gaunt features could jolt from farcical to tragic.
They attacked him and said, "You used to be so good, what's the matter with you?" And Johnny was devastated.
This was a man contending with the changing tastes of his time, but also grappling with his own sexuality in a deeply repressive era.
There's always this danger you'd be beaten up. I mean, this was a very common experience.
Minton was everywhere, and then almost overnight, and strangely to me, he was nowhere. His was a life cut tragically short. Now I'm plunging back into his world, from war-torn London to the sultry Mediterranean and beyond, to find out what happened.
It seems a terrible iniquity to me that this enchanting man has been all but lost to us. I want to show why John Minton is still important and celebrate his incredible body of work. It's time to invite Johnny back to the party that he left all too soon.
I just, oh Johnny, oh Johnny, oh Johnny.
Soho. Life after dark with an enamel gloss and the cracks showing. Garish, gay, avaricious, and a little sleazy at the edges.
Between the 1930s and 50s, Soho was the epicenter of bohemian life in London. Gathered within the pubs, clubs and cafes on these streets was a thriving counterculture, where some of the most revered artists, writers and musicians of their time lived life to the full.
Everything was changing. It was just after the war, England was bankrupt, and we still had rationing. And so out of this depression came this rebellion. People rebelling against their backgrounds and the austerity of England at that time. And the rebellion was finding itself in Soho and expressing itself, I think, in Soho. And Soho was a place where you could breathe. It was fun, and people were very unconventional.
Do you see Johnny Minton as the sort of vanguard of that movement?
Yes. Oh yes, yeah. He was one of the leading lights of that whole thing.
When I first came to London, I gravitated to Soho, naturally, or unnaturally, because of its reputation for decadence, permissiveness and naughtiness, which had been so much of its appeal back in Minton's day. For John Minton and contemporaries of his like Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud,
Soho became their salon, where they took it in turns to paint each other and where drinking companions quickly became their muses. Minton's subjects ranged from fellow painters to legendary boozers.
This is Geoffrey Bernard?
Yes,
Oh
that's
my
Jeff
goodness.
Bernard, yeah.
Wow. That's a very different version of him than we're all used to. That's amazing.
And also young models who caught his eye.
Did he say what kind of picture he was after? Or
No,
model?
no, I don't think he had anything particularly in mind, or maybe he did have something in mind.
Do you mean the centre of the focus of the picture?
Exactly. My head is small. It wasn't my brain he was after.
But long after the party was over, the shades of some of its most famous guests still linger. The likes of Dylan Thomas, Francis Bacon, Lucian, Freud, and Quentin Crisp still loom large in our minds. But what about Johnny Minton? How did this man, now all but forgotten, become the life and soul of Soho, or as Quentin Crisp himself observed, one of the crowned heads of Bohemia? To find out, we need to meet the striving 21-year-old artist who fetched up in London at the onset of war. This was a young man imbued with the spirit of romanticism and theatricality. At Reading School, Minton had been a lively and spirited performer, the crowned king of Bohemia even then. At St John's Wood Art School, Minton formed a close bond with fellow student Michael Ayrton, and together they began to establish their reputation as artists within the cultural vacuum that war had created.
The thing that people don't know or don't remember about those 6 years was the complete cut-off. There was nothing but one picture a month in the National Gallery, and otherwise there was nothing but the English tradition, because there was no France, there was no anything except sort of Leeds Lend. And so in a way, because there was nothing else, various people like Johnny Minton and Keith Vaughan and I got a sort of reputation as being the sort of major figures.
While waiting to be called up for the Pioneer Corps, Minton was drawn to the romantic desolation of London and took to drifting through its blitzed wasteland. For Minton, this shattered urban wilderness and almost lunar devastation fueled an imagination already brimming with influences. These bruised, twisting landscapes are populated by waif-like self-portraits, Minton as a lonely youth in the shadows, both haunting and haunted. But there's something else going on in these pictures. I can detect a familiar longing in them, a sort of ache. Minton took to cruising the docks down here in Poplar, hoping, he said later, to pick up anyone who would have me, particularly sailors, because I've developed all kinds of obsessions with them. Here in the blackout came Minton's sexual awakening. It was a heady time. The threat of prosecution, homosexuality was still illegal, offset against the thrill of finding love among the ruins as the bombs rained down. Escaping the horrors of war, Minton's figures took refuge deep in the English and Welsh landscape. And here, I think, came a powerful artistic awakening. These ambitious, crepuscular scenes secured him a leading place within a newly recognized British art movement, neo-romanticism.
I think it's in these exquisite pen and ink drawings that Minton begins to find his voice. I love the deep blacks, the swirling linear patterns, the solitary figures enveloped womb-like by nature. But they also seem to give great expression to a private angst during these war years. Look at how the central figures are half turned or fully turned away or totally obscured, as if Minton were retreating from a world of anxiety into one of bucolic fantasy and private mystery.
I think what propelled John Minton into the public eye was his association very early on with the British neo-romantics such as Paul Nash and Graham Sutherland, and that movement was hugely popular in Britain at the time because, you know, they were introducing modernist elements, but it was all very accessible. It wasn't too avant-garde, it was more suited to kind of British taste.
Discharged from the army after confessing he was homosexual, Minton plunged himself into bohemian life in the pubs and clubs of Soho. And it was there he met and joined forces with two other leading neo-romantics, Robert Cahoon and Robert McBride. The studio in Notting Hill that Minton came to share with this formidable Scottish duo became a tendril to Soho. And gatherings here, usually on Sunday evenings, quickly became the stuff of legend.
Well, here we are. I've been dying to see their living and working space, and this is it. The last remaining identical studio to theirs. It's easy to imagine the place in full swing. Cahoon here at his easel, swigging whiskey and putting another stroke to his latest painting. McBride back there in the galley frying up herrings and oatmeal for the guests. Maybe Dylan Thomas already passed out in one of the deep armchairs next to the frail, half-blind Wyndham Lewis. And then maybe Lucian Freud sneaking in, accompanied by some pretty young model. And then as the Roberts sing a Scottish ballad, Johnny Minton takes to the floor and dances a Highland jig over a pair of crossed umbrellas. And that was just a night in.
Despite the bizarre domestic setup, the confined space proved very fertile, particularly for Minton, who was now being courted by prestigious galleries.
There just weren't many places where you could exhibit if you were a contemporary artist in the late 30s or early 40s. And for Minton to be given exhibitions 3 years running at the Redfern Gallery in 1943, 44 and 45 was really a very impressive start for any young man's career. It was a well-known place for where you went to see new art. And it had both a ground floor and a basement area, as it still does have today. And perhaps with a note of jealousy, the two Roberts, Cahoon and McBride, would refer to it as Min's bargain basement, because Minton was doing rather well with his sales at that time.
But simmering beneath the surface were mounting tensions as Minton struggled to conceal his growing but unrequited feelings for Cahoon, much to McBride's irritation. He could often be found out here on the stairs, weeping, or drunkenly demanding to be let back into the studio after one more confrontation with McBride. I think it must have been with a huge sense of relief that Minton fled to Cornwall in the summer of 1944. Sanctuary came in a gypsy caravan belonging to his friend the poet W.S. Sidney Graham. And it was here that Minton came to pass 6 blissful weeks. Sidney Graham had already established contact with the burgeoning art scene over the way in St Ives. He felt a great affinity with painters, and in particular with Minton's neo-romantic works, often pinning up reproductions above his writing desk. I find the trees down in the dell below the caravans becoming confused with a Minton vision, wrote Sidney Graham, observing a newly invigorated Johnny from the one he'd known in London.
During the long summer days of 1944, Minton roamed the fields and coves, not to mention the pubs, along this coast. The light and warmth refreshed him, and the intricate perspectives all around revived his desire to paint. This Cornish retreat began to affect his attitude towards landscape, a move away from the introspective melancholy of the neo-romantic towards a new horizon, one, he said, that offered the promise of long, strange journeys to elaborate, exotic lands. God, how I love the sea, Minton wrote to a friend back in London. Treacherous, cold, impersonal, caught by the moon and shifted in the giant tides, the waves breaking forever with the subtle cruelty of terrible indifference. The paintings Minton produced from Cornwall are amongst my favourite works. What I find most appealing is just how different they are from each other. You can almost chart his progression from painting to painting as he tried out new styles.
I think that's the moment he comes alive. It's the introduction of colour. He's got an extraordinary colour palette. That's when he's embracing certain avant-garde elements and incorporating them very confidently into a figurative language.
The Cornish idyll came to an end when Minton felt the inexorable pull back to London. But exhilarated by the Cornish light and colour, Minton saw London afresh, and he returned to capture the Thameside settings he had depicted just a few years earlier. Only now he saw them through new eyes. It was these pictures that saw Minton labelled as an urban romantic, but what I love about them is that they seem to represent a familiar tussle between the melancholy and the optimistic. We can see his eye for the tumble down and the rusting and the decaying, but there's also colour and new life in the cranes reconstructing post-war London. By this point, Minton was teaching at Camberwell School of Art and was keen to impart his urban romantic vision to his students.
Minton took us to places like Rotherhithe and Deptford on drawing trips, and these places were always fascinating, like that painting, for instance. In fact, that's almost like wondering if that wasn't one of the paintings which came out of it.
And how did he teach you to look at this landscape? What was he trying to encourage you to find?
Look at the detail. Look for the detail. If you can't find it, if you can't see it, invent it. He would be drawing around us, behind us, and telling us what we're missing.
And how do you picture Johnny when you think of him now?
There ain't a pedestal big enough, because I think he was one of the greats.
Minton loved the company and energy of young people and was keen for his Camberwell students, or Johnny's Circus as they were known, to join his bohemian world.
Minton brought his gang of students, like the Pied Piper, all the way up from Camberwell to Oxford Street, and let them loose on the club, and it was fantastic. And it was loud and exciting. And I think that went across from the band to the young audience. It felt like a liberation. And here's Johnny Minton himself peering into his own drawing. And what's particularly pleasant about it is on centre stage. It's got the spirit of the place, absolutely. It's the freedom of his drawing, and it just flows out of his pen.
There seemed to be no stopping Minton. His exceptional gifts as an illustrator were soon in high demand in what was quickly becoming a golden age of commercial graphic art. Minton, it seemed, was everywhere.
And here is a real indicator of the extent of Minton's fame at this point. This is a copy of Vogue from August 1946. If you got your face into here, then you'd really made it. It's never happened to me. Here he is in an article called Tomorrow's Names. He is a young artist whose drawings and pen and ink are remarkable and whose oils give great promise. It's interesting to note that he's on a par with the theatre director Peter Brook and eclipsing the Roberts down here just as he was emerging from their shadow.
Desperate for his own working space, Minton moved to a new studio in St John's Wood. With his rising popularity and as one of Tomorrow's Names, he was asked to air his views on the BBC's new service for disseminating the arts.
There's no more revealing human personality than the visual artist, for a man will paint only of himself, and of the things he knows, loves, hates, desires. The problem of the symbol, the abstraction which does not imitate nature, but paraphrases its outward appearance and illuminates its inner significance. This is the contemporary painter's dilemma, to find the appropriate symbol in art for his own time, his own revolt, his own necessity for a spiritual belief.
Well, that's the very first time I've ever heard John Minton speak. It's really amazing to hear him crackling through the years like that. It's sort of what I expected. He's very well spoken, very clipped, sounds a lot like actors of the period, but that just gives us a tiny little glimpse, a way of reaching back into the past and holding his hand and getting some sense of the person. I'm very glad it's there, and I feel very privileged to hear it, oddly enough. It's the voice fits the face in a rather pleasing way.
With the war over and travel restrictions lifted, British artists eager for new landscapes took off for the continent. Minton's chance came in the August of 1947. The publisher John Lehman was planning his most ambitious project yet, a travelogue which he intended to be an extremely lavish anti-austerity production. Pairing up Minton with the poet Alan Ross, Lehman dispatched them to Corsica, telling them simply to come back with a book. Ever since I first saw Minton's drawings of Corsica, I've wanted to come here and find the original locations that inspired him.
To sit here sipping pastis in 1947 must have been pure exhilaration after several years of war and the drabness of London, particularly after the Great Freeze in Britain that year, which saw temperatures drop as low as -21 degrees and crops being harvested by drill. Even today I feel a sense of romantic enchantment hanging over the island. It's a very particular place, not quite French, not quite Italian, something very much its own. And as Minton and Ross agreed, life seemed to happen elsewhere. Time was away. A little early for me.
For 3 weeks, Minton and Ross scoured the island, soaking up its atmosphere and dipping into the lives of its inhabitants. Whilst Ross noted down his impressions, Minton worked quickly, missing nothing. As they ventured up into the mountains, the only foreigners on the slow, meandering bus, Ross was astonished at how quickly his travelling companion, asleep on his shoulder, would suddenly jolt to life and leap off at each stop, brandishing pen and paper. These bright, exotic, almost alien climes clearly exhilarated Minton, and he responded with great vigour and intensity. His pen flourished. Like Edward Lear, who visited the island in 1868, Minton had an innate sense of the picturesque. He preferred to work at high noon, when everything was at its most vivid. The intense heat conveyed by hazy rings around the sun and deep black shadows.
He has a very obvious struggle between modernism and conservatism, between modernism and tradition. But when he goes away, he embraces the avant-garde more readily, I think. Especially the paintings of fishermen. They're so bold and colourful. I think John Minton, for a few years, does find a rhythm that he can work with. You feel that he's arrived at a place which is a uniquely John Minton painting.
From the coast road at Calvi, Minton had spied this large Dominican monastery in the hills at Corbera, and he felt compelled to draw it. The place seemed deserted when he and Ross arrived, until the sudden appearance of a squat, elderly monk called Père Aubain, who proceeded to show them around.
This cloistered oasis was a rare moment of calm in Minton's frenetic life. He could have done with more times like this. Père Aubain's wisdom and kindness made a deep impression on the artist. So much so that he became a touchstone for future behaviour. What would Père Aubain say? Minton would exclaim in moments of crisis.
Père Aubain urged his two young visitors to return one day, and so I'd like to think I'm doing so on Johnny's behalf. Corbera, as Alan Ross noted down, was a place to gather wisdom and strength before plunging back into life. Far from the madness of Soho and free from its temptations, Corsica, like Cornwall before it, unleashed a tremendous creative outpouring in Minton. This was him in full flow, inspired, euphoric, magnificent. From the brief time he spent on the island came a staggering volume of work. Over 90 separate drawings, numerous colour line blocks, and large, vibrant oils. And of course, the book itself.
Here it is, a complete book with all the colour. I think it's really one of the most significant illustrated books of the 20th century.
You put it that high?
I would, yes, along with a handful of others. I think it's an astonishing achievement. Looking at the cover, it's particularly brilliant the way that Minton actually uses the white of the paper as a fourth colour, you know, by just leaving that space to give that last glow of sunlight. And this wonderful dramatic wraparound to evoke the exotic travel that was out of the reach of most people. It just exudes a sense of place, I think.
Wow, that's very satisfying. I think that's come out very well. I'll take 10.
You'll have to print them yourself.
Time Was Away quickly became a cult book among illustrators, but it was for his painting talents that Minton was sought out by the Royal College of Art in 1948 to take up the prestigious role of tutor in the School of Painting.
When he came to work in the life room alongside the students, it was as if there was an adrenaline shot in the room itself. It thrilled us to have him working alongside us. He brought in fruit, scattered it around in over tables. Our still lifes had been very dun-coloured things before that, and they'd fitted the Royal College idea of tonal painting. You know, grey lurked, greys lurked. We suddenly realised that we were in the middle of French painting.
For me, this is where Minton reaches something of a crossroads. There's a pull, a tension between his commercial work and his painting. His commercial commissions are piling up by the dozen. He seems unable to turn any of them down, and yet at the same time, he wants to be taken seriously as a painter. And this is an argument, a discussion which resonates to this day throughout the art world and all sorts of spheres of artistic activity. Was he too popular to be serious? What did the critical establishment regard him as, an illustrator or a painter?
But for me, this range and the embracing of the popular are what I really love and admire about Minton. And it's perhaps only in Britain that we would see versatility as a negative. If Minton was having a crisis of conviction, then his problems were compounded by another commission from his most important backer, the publisher John Lehman. 1950 saw the publication of a book that revolutionised British cooking and eating habits. But as its author Elizabeth David was quick to notice, its success was as much down to the stunning book jacket, which stopped window shoppers in their tracks and lured them in. Simply opening its cover was to step out onto the continent. Elizabeth David's recipes were a masterful antidote to post-war austerity and the acute food shortages. Though it's hard to know how one would manage Turkish stuffing for a whole roast sheep or saddle of boar on ration coupons. But the key to the book's success, and that of its follow-up, French Country Cooking, was undoubtedly Minton's charming illustrations, filled with a sense of abundance and joie de vivre. Minton was given a free hand with the illustrations, and here and there his wit shines through. I love this here in the frontispiece, next to the comely maiden bearing fruit. He's managed to smuggle in a depiction of himself as a rather louche sailor boy, hoping, he confided to a friend, to disconcert the eager housewife. This is quintessential Minton, decorative, dazzling, and like Johnny himself, bringing so much fun into other people's lives. I love this little book. It's like a work of art in itself. Minton's style is deceptively simple, but the line is so bold and confident. I wouldn't mind having one of these as a tattoo. With this book, Minton entered the home of the great British public in a way that few artists do. And I think this newfound celebrity status emboldened him to air his opinions freely.
This is a copy of The Listener from January 1950, in its day widely read and highly influential. It contains a letter from Minton written in a fit of fury in response to an article by, of all people, Dr. Mary Stopes, in which he describes Oscar Wilde's activities with stable boys as abnormal and filthy practices. Minton writes, "In this country where the same vicious law which imprisoned Wilde still operates, one looks to those with pretensions to a scientific approach not to be victims of prejudice and intolerance, but to give a lead for at least a saner and more comprehensive attitude towards the homosexual in society. Yours, etc., John Minton." Minton wasn't even sure if they'd print the letter, but they did. And he remarked to a friend that he thought
it might ruin his career. He also questioned where he got his crusading spirit from. To me, as a gay man, I find this the most extraordinary document. This is 7 years before the Wolfenden Report recommended the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, and a full 17 years before it was actually implemented. Minton is never mentioned in the pantheon of gay heroes, but for me, he really should be. I think this is just the most extraordinarily brave thing to do. But it didn't end there. Mary Stopes responded to Minton's letter saying that public defence of such action is shocking, and John Minton shocks me.
Minton managed to emerge from this episode with his reputation intact. And for young gay men like the novelist Paul Bailey, who encountered Minton when he was 17, such courage was life-affirming.
Well, I was very conscious that I was a criminal. I think we all were. But it took exceptional people to display that kind of bravura.
If this letter is a sort of, oh, what the hell, you know? I mean, he's a reluctant martyr. He talks about, he doesn't know where he got his crusading spirit from, but he does this thing quite late on, which in a way is sort of, he martyrs himself.
He was going out on a limb, really. Yeah. There was something about his way of looking at the world, which wasn't confined by Britishness or Englishness, to put it more, specifically.
There's too much Puritanism here.
Absolutely. And I think English Puritanism didn't help people like Minton. Like many gay men of his time, he was attracted to the idea of, we didn't use the word straight then, we used normal. But he was attracted to normal men. And of course it was very difficult because you couldn't make passes unless you were, in the French pub in Soho, getting plastered amongst a lot of other bohemian types. And there's always this danger that the man could invite you outside and there'd be other people waiting and you'd be beaten up. I mean, this was a very common experience.
Minton's sexuality spoke to me very strongly through his pictures, particularly his sensitive portraits of the various young men that he knew. "It is only someone of my own sex," he once wrote, "who can really affect and shake the part of me that is a painter." What's also striking is that the eye is drawn not necessarily to the faces, but to the crotches. And when you put 3 or 4 of these pictures together, it's pretty obvious where Minton's focus lay. All I'll say is, Johnny had a very good eye.
Some years ago, I was lucky enough to buy this drawing by Minton, but it's never been quite clear who the sitter was. That is, until recently, when the same name kept on being suggested to me.
The display held at the Redriff Community Weightlifting Club includes this intriguing performance given by a gentleman named, believe it or not, Spencer Churchill.
And now, I've tracked him down.
Well, I've got something to show you, Spencer. This is a drawing that I own.
Wow. Yeah. Wow, that's me. Wow. My goodness. Yeah. That's how I looked 60 years ago. That's how I used to sit always to pose, because it's the most comfortable way. You know, one arm up there and just like that, always the same pose, because that's, if you've got to sit for an hour or more, that's the way to sit. Thank you very much for showing it to me. But now I've got something to show you.
Oh.
Now, what about this then? Look.
Wow.
There we are.
Wow. I've never seen that reproduced anywhere.
You never?
Never. It's fantastic.
To photograph it, yes.
It's a wonderful picture.
I really like it, It's, if I didn't know how I looked, that's how I think I would look.
That's how you'd want to look?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It took quite a long time because after about half an hour, John, you said, well, sorry, let's go and have a drink. So we'd end up at Muriel's. It was a bohemian hideaway club. We used to go there in the daytime. And it was mostly the painting crowd in the afternoon that were there. Francis Bacon was often there.
3-day benders were not unusual for Minton and his entourage.
Did you have a sense that they were drinking excessively, or did it feel like more normal?
No, I think I got the feeling they were drinking excessively, yes.
This hard drinking culture began to weaken his creative drive, and it brought to the surface unspoken rivalries with contemporaries like Francis Bacon.
He was very cruel to Johnny. They all got a bit drunk, and of course Bacon never drank anything but champagne. And so he takes the champagne bottle and pours it over Johnny's head, you see, and massages in and says, "Champagne for my sham friends and real pain for my real friend," which devastates poor Johnny. Johnny finishes up underneath the seat in Muriel's. I had to drag him out, get him in a taxi, take him home. He was devastated for days that Bacon had kind of degraded him so much.
And as ever, when it all got too much, Minton took flight. This time for Jamaica, where the colours and warmth revived him, and refocused his attention on the canvas. This vast mural of a Jamaican street scene at dusk was exhibited at the Royal Academy's summer exhibition in 1951 and was possibly destined for the wall of one of the West Indian dance clubs in Soho, where Minton liked to go jiving.
However, it ended up being given by Minton to a friend who, struggling to find a wall big enough to hang it, stored it in his shed for over 60 years, where it has remained all but forgotten until now. And for me, it's a revelation in more ways than one. Jamaica, it seemed, opened up a whole new palette for Minton.
I love the thought of this vibrancy exploding onto the drab walls of London. And yet, for all their radiance and languid sensuality, these scenes of exotic escape were out of step with the mood of post-war Britain. And it is at this point that I feel John Minton unwittingly set off on a slow path into obscurity.
Post-war, Britain was exhausted. People were slowly becoming aware of all the horrors of the Second World War. I think Lucian, Freud and Francis Bacon really spoke of their times much more eloquently than John Minton could. And especially Bacon spoke of that, I mean, incredibly powerfully and disturbingly. And he was also Bacon was a much more radical artist in terms of what he was doing formally. I think, Britain was coming to terms with all those things and with austerity. And I think Bacon and Freud spoke to a kind of existential angst, which Minton just didn't, really. He didn't capture a mood.
And the widening gulf between Minton and his contemporaries became even more apparent after he sat for one of them.
This is a portrait of Minton by Lucian Freud, commissioned by Minton himself after he'd seen Freud's portrait of Francis Bacon in early 1952. There were numerous sittings, with Freud sitting intimately, almost uncomfortably close to his sitter, so he could scrutinize Minton's features. He distorts the face for expressionistic effect and gives it an almost deathly pallor. The result renders Minton as a tortured saint, almost Christ-like, and it shocked and angered those who knew him. But perhaps it took a portrait like this for people to see him clearly. Rather chillingly, Freud later said he thought Minton commissioned this portrait with his own death in mind.
Minton, in his portraits, and his figure drawings never quite has the psychological depths that Freud brings to his portraits. I think that's why they're powerful. I think that's why they're penetrating. Minton seems not to be interested at all in the psychology or of his sitters. You know, they are figures in space, framed by all the props in a stage set, almost. His sitters are almost like props themselves. A piece of furniture might catch your gaze as quickly as the sitter in the portrait does.
And yet these spaces and props proved inspirational for at least one of Minton's up-and-coming students.
Your pictures of mine, like girls with their heroes, of girls lined up in front of pictures of Elvis Presley, are very much like Johnny's portrait of Neville Wallace, where he's done exactly that. He's arranged pieces pinned to the wall at the back, and they're very recognisable, your drawings by other people and pieces of art, and that's a motif I've used quite often, and it must have come from there, I realise now. I mean, I wouldn't have invented that without seeing that picture, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I love that picture.
It's such a good portrait.
Whilst he was working on the portrait of Neville Wallace, Minton had just completed a large canvas portraying the dying moments of one of his heroes, Admiral Lord Nelson. Many were surprised by him choosing to opt for a traditional history painting. But for another of the Royal College students, there was nothing traditional about it at all.
Well, I see in his painting of the death of Nelson a reference to Cézanne's approach to pictorial space. That is to say, the lack of conventional perspective is startling. Because what Minton has done, definitely, is to push the foreground down, pull the centre forward, and furthermore, he's flooded it with light so that your attention is drawn to that which pulls it up. And that is perception. That is how things look. This is how something is seen. And this was a very, very powerful underpinning of the modern movement.
But Minton's tentative embrace of modernism was too little, too late, and exposed him as increasingly out of touch.
I think one of Minton's problems was that in the 40s and the early 50s, he was the young spark of British painting, and it was slowly going away from him. And the Francis Bacons and the Lucian Freuds were coming to the forefront. And he recognised that painting was changing.
These were fast-moving times. A new art movement was blowing in from across the ocean. Abstract expressionism ushered in a new dominance by American artists, and with it New York, not London, became the centre of the Western art world.
By 1950, America, or rather New York, had become the world's most alive centre for progressive art. This example of it is by Jackson Pollock.
This was the new energy in painting, and John Minton was becoming increasingly lost. It was very alienating. He instinctively disliked abstraction. He was staunchly in the figurative camp. In many ways, he was quite a conservative artist. He was a very English artist. He felt he had his moment, and it was being snatched away from him by something which was bolder, more exciting, far more radical, and he didn't know how he would fit in what direction he could move to reclaim his place in the art world.
And the direction he took was surprising, to say the least.
This epic canvas, entitled The Dice Throwers, hung in the Royal Academy's summer exhibition in 1954. The underlying intention being that it might get Minton elected as an Associate Royal Academician. But around all these epic history paintings, there's something of a sense of panic.
It smacks of desperation to me that, unable to embrace the avant-garde, Minton instead sought the approval of the art establishment.
It's said that on the day of the election, Minton sat by the telephone in the senior common room waiting for the news that he'd been chosen. But the call never came. It's curious that Minton, once the rebel, now yearned for convention and respectability. But it was futile.
In the face of further rejection, Minton spiraled out of control. Drunk most of the time, his behavior was increasingly erratic. As ever, donning his familiar mask of gaiety, he hit Soho hard.
When Johnny walked in, there was this band. They would start playing Oh Johnny, How You Can Love, you know. And so he would immediately go on the floor and start dancing.
Oh Johnny, how you can love. Oh Johnny.
And he didn't have a partner. He would just go and dance on his own.
You make my sad heart jump.
While Minton gyrated like a crazed marionette, his entourage of hangers-on worked their way through the champagne, or chateau hysteria, as he called it.
Johnny, please tell me, dear, what makes me love.
Another regular remembers how on one such occasion, Minton grew increasingly sullen as the evening progressed, before muttering angrily, "I'm only liked because I'm rich. I can buy anyone I want."
Minton had always thrived on the company of his students and been adored by them. But now, in a cruel twist, some turned on him. The catalyst was an exhibition of modern American art at the Tate Gallery in January 1956, where the spectacle of large canvases by the likes of Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock sparked great interest amongst Minton's students.
And in the Royal College of Art, they were putting their canvases on the floor. Robin Denny was not only throwing paint onto the canvas, but bitumen. He was setting fire to the bitumen. So you get these wrecks of paintings, you know, with drips and drops and burnt bits and so on. And Minton walked in and couldn't take it because he thought that you must have a love for your subject. What you paint matters.
But then they attacked him and they got him up against the wall, a group of the students at Royal College, and said, "You used to be so good, what's the matter with you? Why don't you join in this sort of thing?"
And that is where he let rip. He looked at this sort of abstract painting by Robin Denny and he said, "Well, what's it all about? You know, what's happening here?"
Denny and a fellow student, Dick Smith, took umbrage at Minton's critique and drafted a harsh rebuttal printed in the college news sheet.
It was pointed and accurate, and Minton must have felt cut off by it. You know, that he was no longer part of the flow of where things are going. He couldn't relate to it. So it did possibly deepen his depression.
Unable to hold down his job, Minton took a leave of absence from the Royal College of Art. He intended to flee London, but was then offered work designing sets for the Royal Court Theatre, where he met a young stage carpenter called Kevin Maybury.
I heard that he was in love with some boy who worked on the stage there, where he was doing the decor for or something, and that didn't come to anything, and I think that just pushed him over the edge. If you're really down, it just takes one little thing just to push over the edge, and I think that's what must have happened with John. You know, he was so lonely, always lonely, you know, searching. He never found, obviously, what he wanted.
Alone, isolated, and having lost faith in himself as an artist, Minton began to give away his work and tell people he didn't want to live beyond 40. Matters came to a head in early 1957. And now, I'm going to meet a woman
who has never forgotten the last time she encountered Johnny Minton.
It was a Saturday morning in late January, and I was walking along the King's Road, and John Minton was on the opposite side of the road, and he beckoned to me to come and have a coffee with him. I went across and sat down at a table, and it was at that point that he started to bring out rolls of notes out of his pocket, and he said to me, "Take it, it's no use to me anymore." And I said, "Oh, don't be silly, you can't give me all that money." Then he said, "All right, if you won't take my money, then I'll give you something else, but wait here for me. I'll be back, so don't go away." And eventually, he did return, and he brought me this.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. Wow. It's quite a moment, this. I don't know, it's such a surprise. But it's also, it's so troubling, isn't it?
Yes. This is definitely the figure of John Minton. This man in the black cloak is Death. And the slave is ushering him into the underworld and giving him to death. And I think all these lights are the underworld in the background. That's my interpretation.
This really brings everything full circle. There are lots of early pictures from the 40s, the Desolate Stage and The Dream, which feature a self-portrait of a reclining nude, which is Minton, in these rather bleak landscapes. And then I think it's really interesting that his state of mind is bringing him back to these early drawings.
Yeah. I'm sure this was the very last one he did.
Yeah.
It must have been. He was telling me he was going to kill himself. That's horrible.
It's an appointment with death, isn't it?
It's really horrible.
On the following evening, Sunday the 20th of January 1957, here at his Chelsea studio, Minton was discovered unconscious in bed, with an empty bottle of sleeping tablets nearby. He was pronounced dead on arrival at St Stephen's Hospital, half a mile away. 2 words on his death certificate stood out: killed himself. John Minton was 39 years old.
It's very hard not to view Minton's life through a veil of gloom, but to me it more reflects the extreme ups and downs of his own personality. Wild gaiety followed by plunging despair. It's not one long walk to the gallows. There was so much beauty and joy and exuberance and talent in Johnny Minton. That he chose not to live past 40 shouldn't take away from what he packed into his brief time. His life and his art are a gift to all of us.
Johnny, oh, 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 Johnny, oh. Oh, Johnny, Johnny, please tell me, dear, what makes me love you so.